The boy had never seen a car move. He knew what they were. Metal shells scattered across the roads like the rib cages of enormous beasts, their windows dark and empty, their insides long since claimed by rust and the patient work of vines. But movement was a concept he understood only through stories, through the way the old ones spoke of it, their voices taking on a quality of reverence mixed with something that might have been grief. In the world Kael had been born into, cars were monuments. They were obstacles. They were shelter when the rain came too hard. They were not alive. He stood now in the center of what maps, old maps that crumbled in your hands if you weren't careful, called Interstate 95, somewhere south of what had once been Richmond. The asphalt beneath his bare feet was warm from the sun, the cracks between the slabs deep enough to trap small stones. Weeds had begun their slow work of reclamation, pushing through with a patience that seemed almost mocking. Kael was 17 years old. He had walked this stretch of road 7 times in his life, and each time the forest seemed to be winning a little more ground. Each time there were fewer cars visible from horizon to horizon. The thing about the great mortality, his grandmother had told him once before she'd stopped talking altogether, was that people expected it to be loud. They expected screaming and chaos and the visible signs of catastrophe. What nobody anticipated was the quiet, the terrible, suffocating quiet that came after. The way the world didn't end with a bang or a whimper, it ended with an absence, a pause that never quite ended. Kael had been born 19 years after the pulse. That's what they called it in the settlements, when they called it anything at all. The pulse. Sometimes the older generation called it the collapse, with a weight to the word that suggested they were trying to contain something vast within a single syllable. A few of the truly ancient ones, people who had lived in the before times, who remembered electric light and running water from pipes and all the other miracles that seemed to belong to a different species than the one that survived, they called it the end. Full stop. Nothing after it could be anything other than after. After was the only temporal marker that made sense anymore. The pulse had been electromagnetic. Kael knew this because it was one of the few facts that had been preserved, written down in the careful handwriting of those who had decided the future might want to know how everything had broken. A cascading series of solar events, the writing said, though the technical details grew murkier the more you read. Something about the sun, something about the Earth's magnetosphere, something about the power grid that had crisscrossed the continent, like veins carrying electricity instead of blood. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was the same. Every electronic device on the planet had fried simultaneously. Computers, satellites, automobiles, medical equipment, water treatment plants, air traffic control systems, telecommunications networks. Everything that the world had built its existence upon, everything that had lifted humanity out of the agricultural age and into something that had seemed to those living in it like permanence itself. Within 48 hours, the grid had collapsed completely. Within a week, the supply chains that fed the cities had broken down. Within a month, the cities themselves had begun to fail. Hospitals ran out of power and medicine. Water systems couldn't function without electricity. Food distribution networks froze. Factories stopped producing. Trucks stopped moving. Planes fell from the sky. And then, as if that wasn't enough, as if the loss of all technological infrastructure wasn't sufficient catastrophe on its own, the diseases came. Not because of the pulse itself, but because of what the pulse had enabled. The temperature-controlled warehouses stopped working. The refrigerated transport vehicles went dark. Vaccines, blood products, organs awaiting transplant, all of it spoiled within hours. The systems that kept diseases in check, that had driven mortality rates down to nearly nothing in the developed world, that had managed the delicate task of keeping 8 billion people alive simultaneously, all of it had been stripped away in an instant. And then the viruses got very, very busy. The pandemic that followed had been called the Great Mortality officially, though Kael had learned that in different settlements, different regions, even different families, it had different names. The wasting in the southern territories, the silent in some of the mountain communities, the judgment in the more religiously inclined settlements. But everywhere the pattern was the same. Waves of disease, each one different, each one finding new routes through the population, because there were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no antivirals, no medicine of any kind, except what could be made from plants and prayer, and the accumulated folk wisdom of people trying to remember how their great-grandparents had survived before modern medicine existed. The first wave had taken the elderly almost entirely. The second wave, about 6 months after the pulse, had taken the immunocompromised. The third had been pneumonic plague, actual plague, carried by rats that were thriving in the sudden absence of pest control, and that wave had taken roughly 40% of the population in the northern regions. There had been 4 more major waves, interspersed with dozens of smaller outbreaks of diseases that had names or no names, that killed slowly or quickly, that spread through air or water or touch or food. By the time Kael's mother had been born, roughly 20 years after the pulse, the population had stabilized at somewhere around 15 to 20% of what it had been. Some estimates put it lower. Nobody knew for certain. The technology for counting was gone. The settlements kept records after a fashion. Kael's settlement, which was called Haven, and occupied the ruins of what had once been a shopping complex in rural North Carolina, kept meticulous birth and death records on paper. In Kael's lifetime, those 17 years, he could recall the names of 73 people who had lived in Haven. There were 48 of them still living. The others had died of illness, accident, malnutrition, or in 3 cases, violence. The death rate had stabilized somewhat, but it was still high compared to what the old records suggested. Life expectancy in the before times had been roughly 80 years. In Haven, it was perhaps 40, if you were lucky enough to avoid childhood illness and accidents. Kael stood motionless on the interstate, listening. The quality of silence on the empty roads was different from the silence of the forest, though he couldn't quite articulate why. The road was a human absence, a place that had been shaped by human intention, but was now being slowly unmade. The forest was a different thing. The forest was simply what came next, what had always been waiting underneath the thin veneer of civilization. He heard it then, a sound that made his shoulders tense. Not a car. That was impossible, and besides, he would have seen it from a distance across the open road. But voices, human voices, multiple people, moving through the trees on the eastern side of the highway. Kael moved quickly without overthinking it. His hand went to the knife at his belt, a good one made from a piece of old steel that the blacksmith in Haven had painstakingly worked into shape, and he began walking back toward the tree line on the western side. He didn't run. Running drew attention, and running on an open road meant no cover until you reached the trees. Walking meant you could still react if necessary. The voices were getting closer. Kael could make out words now, though not clearly enough to understand them. There were at least 3 people, possibly 4. They sounded young, but that might have been deceptive. Sound traveled strangely in the open like this. He reached the tree line and immediately moved back into the forest, far enough that the road was no longer visible behind him, but not so far that he lost the sound of the voices. This was a balance he'd learned young, being aware enough to know what was happening without being close enough to be easily discovered. The world after the pulse was not particularly dangerous compared to some of the stories he'd heard from other settlements, but it was dangerous enough. People traveling in groups like this could be refugees from a failed settlement, bandits looking for supplies, or simple travelers. You couldn't know until they showed themselves, and showing yourself first meant giving up the advantage. The voices passed on the other side of the road, moving north. Kael waited for a long time after they were out of hearing, then another long time after that. Finally, he made his way back to the road. This was why he'd come out here ostensibly. The council in Haven had sent him on a scouting run to check the northern supply routes, to see if anything had changed in the 6 months since the last formal expedition. But truth be told, Kael had become increasingly restless in Haven over the past year. The settlement was stable, at least by the standards of the world after the pulse. They had enough food, enough shelter, enough security that death wasn't an immediate concern. By every objective measure, it was safe and productive. That was precisely what was making him lose his mind. He was 17, or near enough to it. The exact date of his birth wasn't known. His mother had died in childbirth, and there had been no records kept from the first few years of his life. The settlement's leadership had estimated his age based on his size and development, which meant he could be anywhere from 16 to 18, but probably 17. And 17 in the world after the pulse meant something different than it had meant before. The world before. The before times the age of electricity and networks and impossible luxuries, that world had been one where a 17-year-old boy could postpone adulthood, could attend school, could be in a state of extended dependence on adults and institutions. That world was gone. In the new world, 17 meant you were nearly adult. You could work full days without question. You could participate in the dangerous tasks that communities required for survival: hunting, farming, gathering, defense. You could theoretically be sent to another settlement, or could leave on your own and nobody would think it particularly strange. Many people did leave settlements when they reached this age. Some went seeking family members. Some went in search of places rumored to have better conditions. Some simply couldn't stand the weight of other people and preferred to take their chances in the wild. But Kael hadn't left. He wasn't sure why. He had no family to search for. His grandmother, who had raised him, had died when he was 12. He had no particular reason to believe other settlements were better. Haven was as good as any place got in this world, and better than most. So what kept him there? Novelty, perhaps. Experience. Information. The world after the pulse had so few new things in it that something as simple as a journey of exploration had become an event that mattered. The council had assigned him to scout the northern route, and he'd accepted, because the alternative was staying in Haven, and staying in Haven meant doing the same tasks he'd done 1,000 times before: splitting wood, tending crops, processing fish from the stream, mending tools, teaching the younger children how to read from the precious books that remained. None of it was unimportant. All of it was necessary, and all of it made him want to scream. He walked north through the forest, parallel to the interstate but keeping to the trees. The route was familiar enough. He'd walked it enough times that he could navigate in near total darkness if necessary. The trees were changing as he moved further south to north, gradually shifting from the pines and oaks that dominated the immediate region into something more mixed. This was the transition zone, according to the old ecology books that Haven preserved. The boundary between different forests, different climate zones, different ecosystems. It was one of the few places where you could almost see the hand of the before times at work, in the boundaries of the old national forest that had existed before the pulse, and still somehow was being maintained by the settlement of Cumberland, which lay about 30 miles north. Cumberland was a legend of sorts in Haven's understanding. It was supposedly one of the largest surviving settlements on the East Coast, with several hundred people. They had managed to preserve knowledge, technology, skills. They had schools. They had something approaching a functioning government. They had specialized roles for people beyond just survive or die. When Haven talked about Cumberland, it was with a mixture of awe and skepticism. The way people talked about cities in the before times. It might be real, or it might be more myth than fact, embellished through generations of storytelling. Kael had never been there. The council had never sent an expedition that far north, but the supply routes still needed to be checked. The hope was that if Cumberland still existed and still functioned, they might maintain the roads to some degree and might have news of other settlements. Hope was always in short supply in the New World, but it was cheaper than despair. He made camp as the sun began to set, moving away from the road far enough to be invisible from any passing travelers, but not so far that he'd get lost trying to return to it in the morning. He had supplies: dried meat, hardtack, a water filter, fire-starting materials, a sleeping roll that had been carefully maintained and patched dozens of times. The art of camping had been recovered through necessity in the years after the pulse. There were people in Haven who had been born after it, who knew nothing of hotels or motels or any of the shelter infrastructure of the before times. To them, making a camp in the forest was simply what you did when you traveled, with no sense of it being anything but normal. Kael built a fire, small enough not to be visible from the road, and ate some of his dried meat and hardtack. He had a notebook with him, another precious artifact from before the pulse, and he wrote in it in the fading light, noting the location, the direction of travel, the group of travelers he'd heard but not seen. The notebook was part of the formal record, When he returned to Haven, it would be copied into the settlement's records, and the information would be part of the collective knowledge the community possessed about the wider world. The before times he'd read in the preserved books had been an age of information abundance. There was simply too much information, and the problem had been filtering it, organizing it, determining what was important and what could be ignored. It was almost impossible to imagine. In the world he lived in, information was precious and scarce. Every piece of knowledge about the wider world, every detail about what was happening in other settlements, every rumor about conditions in distant places, all of it mattered. They hoarded it, they traded it, they preserved it in writing because they could never be certain when someone who possessed it might die. He slept poorly, as he often did when traveling. His mind was too active, jumping from thought to thought. He wondered about the group he'd heard, where they were from, where they were going, what circumstances had put them on the road. He wondered about Cumberland. He wondered, as he often did, what it would have been like to live in the before times, in a world of such overwhelming material abundance that young people like him could spend years not working, not contributing, simply studying and developing skills for jobs that might not even exist yet. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a dream that people had all collectively agreed to have. In the morning he woke to find it raining. Not hard, just a steady drizzle that made everything wet and cold. He packed up his camp, ate some more hardtack, drank water, and continued north. The rain was fine. It would make his footprints more difficult to follow, and it would make him less visible to anyone traveling on the road. By mid-morning, he began to notice signs of recent activity. Cut branches still fresh, a spot where someone had made a fire recently. The charred remains were less than a week old by his estimation. Someone had definitely passed through this area, and more than once. The question was whether it was regular activity from Cumberland or something else. The road had changed too. At first he thought it was his imagination, but as he moved further north the evidence became undeniable. The worst of the weeds had been cleared from stretches of the highway. Several of the abandoned cars had been moved, pushed into neat piles at regular intervals, and there were markers, carved symbols on trees, spray-painted arrows on concrete. Someone was maintaining this road. Kael felt something shift in his chest. Possibility. Change. The world he inhabited was so static, so locked into patterns established by sheer habit and necessity, that any indication of active change felt almost transgressive. He began to move more carefully, keeping watch for any signs of current activity. He found the patrol around mid-afternoon. There were 4 of them, and they found him before he saw them. Or more accurately, they stepped out of the trees deliberately, in a formation that suggested they'd been tracking him for some time. Kael had his hand on his knife before he even registered that they were carrying weapons more sophisticated than anything he'd ever seen in Haven. Not guns. The pulse had rendered all electronic weapons essentially useless, and mechanical firearms were unreliable enough that most settlements had abandoned them. But bows that looked professionally made, crossbows with intricate systems of pulleys and tension, and spears with heads that gleamed in the filtered light with an almost mirror-like shine. "Easy," the woman in the lead said, holding up a hand. She was older than him, perhaps in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back severely and scars on her forearms that spoke of a life lived with violence. "We're not looking for trouble. You traveling alone?" Kael's mind worked through possibilities in rapid succession. He could try to run, but the forest here was more open than he'd like, and these people clearly knew it better than he did. He could fight, but 4 armed people against 1 knife suggested a specific outcome. He could talk. "Yes," he said carefully, "scouting for Haven, north of here." The woman exchanged a look with one of the others, a man about her age with the kind of weathered face that suggested decades outdoors. "Haven," she said. "Never heard of it." "It's a settlement, about 80 miles south. We send scouts out periodically to check the condition of the routes and gather information." The woman nodded slowly. "I'm Commander Risa, from Cumberland. These are Scouts Theron, Mira, and Kess." She gestured to the 3 people with her. "What's your name, young man?" "Kael." "Well, Kael from Haven, I think you've found what you were looking for. Cumberland is real. We maintain these routes. We've been trying to make contact with the scattered settlements for several years now, but most of them are either too far or too paranoid to respond to overtures. Haven't heard of it, though. Where exactly is it? Kael described the location of Haven as precisely as he could, and watched as Risa's expression shifted through several different emotional registers. Recognition and then something that might have been sadness. That's the old shopping complex area, right? North Carolina, between Richmond and the coast? Yes, Kael said, surprised. That's where the ruins were that we repurposed. I've been there, Risa said quietly. Before the Pulse, I mean. Long time ago. My parents took me on vacation. We stopped at a hotel near there. The whole area was packed with people, even off-season. She looked at him directly. How many people in Haven? 48 living at the moment. We have births and deaths regularly. Right now the population is stable around that number, maybe a bit higher if the harvests are good. Risa nodded, and then did something that surprised him. She smiled. Well, Kael from Haven, congratulations. You've just made first contact. Come on. We have a camp about 5 miles north of here. You can tell us everything about your settlement over dinner, and we'll tell you about Cumberland. Fair? Kael considered this. It could be a trap, but traps required a purpose that he couldn't quite identify. Cumberland had no apparent reason to deceive him, and significantly more reason to establish genuine contact with a settlement. Besides, he'd gotten exactly what the council had sent him out to do, to find Cumberland and to confirm that the settlement still existed. Fair, he said, removing his hand from his knife. Lead the way. The camp was impressive. 30 people or more with organized tents, a proper water system that used gravity from a nearby stream, communal fire pits, and what appeared to be a functional workshop with actual tools. Risa introduced him around briefly and then escorted him to a tent where a man who introduced himself as Governor Kael was conducting some kind of administrative work, writing on paper with what appeared to be actual ink. Ah, Kael said, looking up, a messenger from the outer settlements. Sit, sit. Risa, bring him something to eat. Kael, you've had quite a journey, I imagine. How long have you been traveling? 2 days, Kael said. South from Haven. Scouting mission? Yes. The council wanted to know if the northern route was still clear, and if there were any large settlements we didn't know about. Kael set down his pen carefully and folded his hands. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with white hair and the kind of composed bearing that suggested he'd spent a life in positions of authority. I have many questions for you, he said. But first, let me tell you what I think. Haven was established, if I'm not mistaken, approximately 20 years after the Pulse. It was founded by survivors who had evacuated from nearby cities and established a settlement in a structurally sound building. At its peak, it had a population of perhaps 100 people. Over time, that number has fluctuated due to disease, accident, and a few violent incidents. Currently, it's stable at around 48 people, and the community has developed sustainable food production and a basic educational system. How close is that? Kael felt a chill run down his spine. Very close. How did you know? Because I sent expeditions to that location 40 years after the Pulse, Kael said. And again 30 years after. It was empty then. Either the settlement hadn't been established yet or it had failed. But the location made sense for a settlement. I told people to keep an eye on it, to attempt contact if anyone traveled that far south. You're the first confirmation I've had that it's actually been established and has sustained itself to this day. A woman entered the tent with a plate of food, some kind of stew with vegetables, and what appeared to be fish along with bread that actually looked like it came from an oven rather than being hardtack baked in a fire. Kael took it gratefully and began to eat. The food was better than anything he'd had in Haven in months. The fact that Haven still exists is significant, Kael continued. It means that human settlements once established can persist. It means that the knowledge of how to survive in this world isn't locked into a few locations, but can be sustained in multiple places. Risa mentioned you said the population is stable. Around 48, Kael confirmed between bites. It fluctuates a bit. Bad winters are harder than good ones. Disease still takes people, but births roughly equal deaths now, which wasn't true in the earliest years. Births roughly equal deaths, Kael repeated. That's an important equilibrium. At what population level does a settlement become stable? Kael shook his head. I don't know. Haven maintains records, but only going back to its founding. We don't have anything older than that. The elders talk about other settlements, some larger, some smaller, but we don't have consistent information about which ones are still functioning. Kael leaned back and steepled his fingers. This is the core problem we face, he said. Knowledge is fragmented. Each settlement develops its own practices, its own understanding of how to survive. But there's no systematic way for that knowledge to propagate. Cumberland has approximately 500 people now. We've been established for about 70 years. We've managed to preserve more of the pre-pulse knowledge than most settlements, and we've developed new systems as well. But there are still vast gaps. We don't know if what works for us will work for a settlement of 48. We don't know if there are better practices being used somewhere else that we've simply never encountered. Isn't that why you maintain the roads? Kael asked. For communication? Partly, Kael said. But communication is useless if there's no one to communicate with. You could be the entire reason we've done this work, so that one day someone like you would find us and tell us that Haven exists. And now we know. So the question becomes, what do we do with that information? Over the next 2 days, Kael was thoroughly debriefed by various members of Cumberland's leadership. They wanted to know everything. Haven's structure, its leadership, its resources, its population demographics, its food systems, its defenses, its technology level, its access to medical knowledge. They had systematic questionnaires that suggested they'd been developing their inquiry methods for years. And in exchange, they told him about Cumberland. The settlement had been established by a combination of military personnel, from a now-defunct base engineers, from a university, and survivors from nearby towns who had coalesced around the leadership of Kael, a former university administrator who had been on campus when the pulse happened. Over 70 years, they had managed to achieve something remarkable. They had preserved not just survival skills, but knowledge infrastructure. They had a library of books, saved from university collections and public libraries. They had people who had been trained in the before times and had passed their knowledge to others. They had experimented with different technologies and found ways to replicate some of them without electronic components. We have functioning glassware for chemistry, one of the scholars, a woman named Dr. Sarah, explained. We're able to produce some medicines by extracting compounds from plants and minerals. Not everything. We can't replicate antibiotics effectively yet, but things like pain relievers, fever reducers, contraceptives. And we're working on vaccines. It's slow, and we have no way to test them properly, but we're trying. We also have water mills, another man named Pavel added, for grinding grain and doing other mechanical work, and we're experimenting with different metallurgy techniques. We've found deposits of iron nearby and have gotten relatively good at smelting and working it. The tools you'll see around the settlement are mostly our own manufacture, not salvaged from before. Kael found himself increasingly in awe of what Cumberland had managed to achieve. It was radically different from Haven, which had focused primarily on subsistence and security. Cumberland had taken the luxury of a larger population and more stable conditions to do something almost impossible. They had created institutions and infrastructure designed to preserve knowledge and push the boundaries of what was possible. But he also noticed something else, something that disturbed him. Cumberland was deeply stratified. There was a leadership class, administrators and specialists who had authority and made decisions. There was a laboring class, people who farmed and built and performed the basic tasks of survival. And there was something else, a professional class of scholars, engineers, and skilled workers who occupied a middle position and who seemed to have significantly better living conditions than the general population. There were visible differences in nutrition, in the quality of their housing, in the amount of work they were expected to do. When he asked about this delicately, Pavel responded with surprising candor. Yes, we have hierarchy, it's necessary. You can't have specialized knowledge workers if they're also supposed to be out in the fields all day. So we've created a system where a percentage of the population does the labor, and a percentage is freed up to maintain and develop knowledge and systems. It's not perfectly fair, but it works. Is it sustainable? Kael asked. Having that division? Pavel shrugged. So far. We haven't had a major uprising or revolt. People understand why it's necessary. But honestly, we don't know if it's sustainable long-term. This is all unprecedented. We're making it up as we go." On his third day in Cumberland, Kael called him to his administrative tent again. "We want to establish formal relations with Haven," he said. "An exchange of information, possibly trade and periodic contact. I'm going to ask you to carry back a proposal. But before I do, I need to know, are you willing to do this? It's beyond the scope of your scouting mission. You'd be taking on a responsibility to deliver a message." Kael thought about this. His role was to observe and report. But this was different. This was taking on a role of active diplomatic engagement. It was stepping outside of simple scouting. "Yes," he said, "I'll carry your message." Kael produced a carefully written letter, sealed with wax, in a manner that suggested it had been prepared in advance, waiting only for the right opportunity. "This explains Cumberland's current situation and our desire to establish formal trade and information-sharing relationships. I've also included information about 3 other settlements we know about that you might be able to contact. The world is larger than Haven probably realizes, Kael. There are communities scattered throughout this region, and most of them are isolated in ways that aren't necessary. We want to change that." Kael carried the letter back to Haven, a journey that took him 5 days instead of the 2 it had taken going north. He found himself constantly reviewing what he'd learned, trying to make sense of it all. The revelation that Cumberland existed and was functioning at such a sophisticated level changed something fundamental about how he understood the world. Haven wasn't some isolated pocket of survival. It was part of a larger network of human communities, all trying to solve similar problems, all attempting to maintain knowledge and build systems for a world without electricity. The council received him and his report with mixed emotions. Haven's leaders, there were 5 of them, elected in a system that was roughly democratic though heavily weighted toward experience and age, listened carefully as he described Cumberland and delivered Kael's proposal for formal relations. "This is significant," said Elena, the oldest member of the council. "If Cumberland is real and functioning, it means some of our theories about settlement sustainability are correct, but it also means we'll have to make decisions about engagement with external powers." "They're not a power," Kael said carefully. "They're just another settlement bigger than us, but bigger than us means they have resources we don't," interrupted Marcus, another council member. "Bigger means they have the ability to pressure us, to demand things, to potentially threaten us if we don't comply with their wishes. We need to be careful about how we engage with them." The debate went on for hours. Some council members wanted to accept the proposal immediately, seeing it as an opportunity to access Cumberland's knowledge and resources. Others were deeply skeptical, worried about the implications of being incorporated into a larger system. In the end, they voted to send a delegation north to meet with Kael and negotiate the terms of any relationship. Kael was asked to be part of that delegation, a role that elevated him from simple scout to something approaching ambassador. It was simultaneously thrilling and deeply unsettling. He was 17 years old. He didn't have the experience or authority to negotiate anything, but he also had already established initial contact, which gave him a certain status. They sent a group of 6, Elena and Marcus from the council, 2 skilled tradesmen who might be able to assess Cumberland's technology level and capabilities, and Kael. The journey north took longer because Elena was in her 60s and wasn't the strongest walker, but it also gave them time to discuss strategy and prepare for negotiations. "We need to understand what they want from us," Elena said as they walked. "Understanding their motivations is key to knowing whether to trust them." Kael said he wants to reconnect the scattered settlements, Kael offered, to recreate something like a network. "Yes, but why?" Marcus pressed. "What's in it for Cumberland? They have what they need. They're stable. What does reconnecting with Haven gain them?" It was a good question, and Kael realized he didn't have a good answer. He'd been so caught up in the wonder of seeing a place like Cumberland that he hadn't thought critically about what their motivations might actually be. When they arrived at Cumberland, they were greeted formally by Kael and a group of his council. What followed was 3 days of negotiations, discussions, presentations, and agreement drafting. Cumberland offered knowledge, They shared medical information, agricultural techniques, engineering principles. They offered trade. They had surplus of certain goods, metal tools, specific food crops, preserved medicines, that they were willing to exchange for goods that Haven might be able to produce, or for information about settlements further south and east. "We're trying to build a network," Kael explained during one of the sessions. "Not a centralized government or anything like that. Each settlement maintains its independence, but through regular contact, through sharing information and resources, we can accelerate progress. If Haven learns a particularly effective farming technique, you can tell us and we can use it. If we develop a better method for preserving food, we can share that with you. It's mutualistic." "What about defense?" Marcus asked, the core question. "What happens if one settlement is threatened by another?" "That's something we'd need to discuss and agree on," Kael said carefully. "We can't promise military aid if that's what you're asking, but we can promise to ensure that settlements aren't isolated, that they have information about threats in their region. An isolated settlement can be picked off easily. A settlement that's part of a network of communication can at least seek help, can send for assistance." By the end of the 3 days, Haven had agreed to enter into a formal relationship with Cumberland. It wasn't a surrender of independence. Haven would remain self-governing, would make its own decisions about who to trade with and how much to share. But it was a commitment to regular contact, to sharing information, and to acknowledging Cumberland as a kind of clearinghouse for regional knowledge and coordination. The impact of the agreement was not immediate, but was significant and growing. Over the following year, Haven received several visitors from Cumberland, including traders and a scholar who spent 2 months teaching the younger population about the history of the before times and sharing Cumberland's preserved knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and basic chemistry. In exchange, Haven sent 2 of its own elders north to share the settlement's expertise in water management and food preservation, areas where Haven had developed particular skills. But the most significant change, in Kael's view, was the expansion of possibility. Haven had existed in a kind of stasis, a steady state where change was minimal, and the primary concern was maintaining stability. With contact established to Cumberland, and through Cumberland to other settlements, Haven suddenly found itself part of a larger discourse about how to rebuild civilization. It was thrilling. It was also deeply uncertain, full of new risks and new opportunities in roughly equal measure. Kael's role in the settlement shifted as a result of first contact. The council began consulting him on matters related to trade and external relations. They sent him north again to participate in a gathering of settlements at Cumberland, the first time multiple communities had assembled in one place since before the Pulse. There were representatives from 12 different settlements, each with their own stories of survival and adaptation, each with different approaches to solving similar problems. The gathering revealed something important. There was no single way to rebuild. One settlement had focused on preserving pre-pulse technology and was attempting to develop mechanical alternatives to electronic systems. Another had taken a more fundamental approach, trying to recreate social structures from the hunter-gatherer era, believing that the technological path had been the source of the pulse and subsequent catastrophe. Most were somewhere in between, picking and choosing from both old and new approaches pragmatically. "The question," said a woman named Asher from a settlement called Rivermark, "is whether we're trying to preserve civilization or rebuild it. Those are fundamentally different projects. If we're preserving, we hold on to knowledge and wait for the right moment to re-implement it. If we're rebuilding, we get to make different choices about what civilization should look like." "Preservation and rebuilding aren't mutually exclusive," countered Dr. Sarah from Cumberland. "We can preserve knowledge while also trying new social structures. We're not bound by what came before." "Aren't we?" said a man from the easternmost settlement, a place called Coastal Haven. "I mean, we're obviously bound by biology, by the physics of the world. We're trying to rebuild on an Earth that has less arable land than it did before, in a climate that's more unstable. We're bound by those constraints whether we like it or not." The discussions went in circles, but that was almost the point. What Kael realized, watching these people debate the future of their world, was that the act of gathering itself mattered more than any specific conclusion they reached. For the first time since the Pulse, there was a conversation happening across settlements. There was a recognition that isolated communities weren't the only viable path forward, but there was also tension beneath the discussions. Kael noticed it in small ways, the way representatives from poorer settlements eyed Cumberland's resources with a mixture of envy and resentment. The way some communities seemed reluctant to share their particular knowledge, worried that it might give other settlements a competitive advantage. The way conversations about resource sharing kept circling back to questions of fairness and equity that seemed almost impossible to resolve. On the third day of the gathering, Kael called a smaller session with the core leadership representatives. "There's something we need to discuss," he said, "and I don't think it will go down well in a larger forum, so I'm bringing it up here first." He waited until they were all seated. There were about 20 people in the room, the most respected leaders from each of the 12 settlements, plus a few scholars and specialists. "Disease," Kael said simply. "Specifically the question of whether we have the capacity to address it collectively rather than individually." There was a long silence. "What do you mean?" Helena asked finally. "I mean that every settlement has plague records. Every settlement has lost significant portions of its population to disease. We've all developed methods for dealing with it: quarantine, isolation, folk remedies. But we haven't approached it systematically. We're not sure which diseases are actually epidemic threats versus which ones are endemic to particular regions. We don't share information about outbreaks effectively. When a new disease appears in one settlement, we have no way to warn others. We tried to do that in the early days," said a man from the central settlements. "It didn't really work. By the time word reached other communities, they'd already been exposed." "Yes," Kael agreed. "But that was with our current communication speed, weeks or months between settlements. I'm proposing something different. I'm proposing that we establish a network of rapid communication. Relay stations, stationed messengers, a system specifically designed to share disease information." "That's a significant logistical burden," one of the other leaders said. "Who pays for it?" "That's the negotiation," Kael said. "But consider the alternative. Another wave of plague like the ones we experienced in the early years could wipe out half the settlements in this region. If we could warn each other, quarantine quickly, share information about treatment methods, we could potentially save thousands of lives." The discussion that followed was more pragmatic than philosophical. There were genuine concerns about resources, about whether the benefit would justify the cost. But there was also a recognition that they'd reached a point where individual settlement survival could no longer be guaranteed by isolation. The network itself had become a form of security. By the end of the gathering, a loose agreement had been formed. Settlements would contribute resources to establish messenger stations between them. Information about significant disease outbreaks would be shared via these networks. In exchange, every settlement would benefit from early warning of disease threats and the collective knowledge about treatment methods that worked. Kael was surprised when Kael pulled him aside as the gathering was breaking up. "You should stay," he said. "In Cumberland, I mean. Not permanently, but long enough to help us set up the communication networks. You know Haven and the southern settlements. You could help establish the infrastructure to connect them to our network." Kael felt something shift inside him. This was an opportunity, a real one. To stay in Cumberland would mean access to knowledge, to a larger community, to something more than the stable monotony of Haven, but it would also mean leaving behind everything he knew. "I need to think about it," he said carefully. "Of course," Kael said, "but think quickly. The sooner we establish these networks, the sooner we can prevent another plague from devastating the region." Kael returned to Haven with the rest of the delegation, but his mind was torn. He had become more peripheral to Haven's daily life over the past year, and he knew it. His role was defined primarily by his relationship to external settlements, by his function as a liaison and source of information. Haven didn't need him in the way it needed the farmers, the craftspeople, the teachers, but Cumberland did. Cumberland had a place for him, a function that mattered, that could expand as the network expanded. He was still wrestling with this when the messenger arrived from Cumberland, 3 weeks after the gathering had ended. The message was brief. There had been an outbreak of an unknown fever in a settlement to the north. 30 people were showing symptoms. Death rate was estimated at around 20%. The Cumberland leadership wanted to know if Haven had any knowledge of similar illness, if they had any herbal remedies or treatments that might help. Haven's council debated this as well. Should they send medical supplies that might be desperately needed? Should they attempt to provide someone with knowledge to help treat the outbreak? Or should they maintain isolation, worried that contact with the afflicted settlement might bring disease back to Haven? In the end, they decided to send supplies and information, but no people. Kael helped prepare the shipment, gathering herbs from Haven stores, preparing a written summary of treatment methods that had been effective against fever in the settlement's past. As he worked, he realized something. He was choosing. The council hadn't explicitly asked, but they were implicitly accepting his recommendation that they should participate in the network's mutual aid system. And in accepting that recommendation, they were accepting that Haven's fate was now connected to the network's fate. That same week, Kael's messenger delivered an invitation. Cumberland was establishing something called the Archive of Northern Settlements, a consolidated library and records center where knowledge from all the settlements could be preserved and organized. They wanted Kael to help establish it, to work with them for the next 2 years to develop systems for managing and sharing information between settlements. Kael accepted. The decision was not universally popular in Haven. Some people saw it as a loss, a young person with valuable skills leaving the settlement. Others worried it was a step toward Cumberland absorbing Haven's independence. Helena, surprisingly, was supportive. "You've done something remarkable, Kael," she told him when he came to tell her his decision. "You've opened a door that we didn't even know existed. Most people in Haven will live their whole lives in this settlement, and that's fine. They'll do important work here, but some people are meant to move between worlds, to connect different communities, to be bridges. I think you're one of those people. Go to Cumberland, learn what you can, come back and tell us about it, or don't come back if you find something better. That's allowed now. That's part of what the network means." He left Haven 2 months later in early spring with a group of traders heading north. The settlement gathered to see him off, which both moved and embarrassed him. He wasn't important enough, surely, to warrant this kind of ceremonial farewell. But the people of Haven seemed to understand something he was still learning, that every person who moved between communities was a vessel carrying ideas, experiences, knowledge, possibility. His departure was an acknowledgement that Haven was not isolated anymore, that the world was reconnecting after 75 years of fragmentation. Cumberland in spring was different from Cumberland in autumn. The climate was warmer, the work season was beginning, and there was an energy of reconstruction and rebuilding that Kael hadn't felt before. Kael assigned him a small room in the archive building, a converted university library that had been preserved and expanded over the decades. His job was to develop systems for cataloging, preserving and sharing knowledge that came from the settlements. The work was absorbing. He found himself learning about information management from scholars who had been trained in the before times, about preservation techniques for documents, about organizational systems that allowed knowledge to be both preserved and accessible. He worked with messengers to develop standardized report formats that all settlements could use when describing disease outbreaks, agricultural yields, technological developments, or other significant events. He helped create a system where this information could be copied and shared, ensuring that no single settlement possessed unique knowledge that others couldn't learn from. It was meaningful work, the kind that clearly advanced the project of network building. But it was also work that took him deeper into Cumberland's internal structure and its contradictions. As he learned more about how the settlement actually functioned, he became increasingly aware of the stratification that Pavel had mentioned. The specialized workers, the scholars, engineers, and skilled craftspeople lived significantly better lives than the general population. They had better housing, better food, access to luxuries like fine paper and preserved books. Meanwhile, the agricultural workers who fed the entire settlement worked long hours in often difficult conditions. One day, while organizing records, Kael discovered something that troubled him deeply. There were documents describing an incident from about 20 years prior, when some of the agricultural workers had organized to demand better conditions. The documents referred to it carefully as a labor action, and noted that it had been resolved through negotiation. But there were also notes about increased surveillance of the worker population afterward, and what appeared to be exile of some of the leaders of the action. Kael brought this to the attention of Dr. Sarah, the scholar who had become something like a mentor to him. "What happened with that labor action?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Sarah's expression shifted. She knew exactly what he was referring to. "That was complicated," she said finally. "There were legitimate grievances, working conditions were very hard, and the division of resources wasn't entirely fair. But the timing was dangerous. We were in the middle of trying to expand food production, and a work stoppage could have threatened everyone's survival. So what they wanted was unreasonable." "No," Sarah said quietly. "What they wanted was probably necessary and correct. But the timing and the way they went about it created a conflict between short-term survival and long-term justice. The leadership of Cumberland made a choice to prioritize short-term survival. Some people exile for organizing wasn't the best outcome, but it also wasn't the worst." This conversation stuck with Kael. It suggested something uncomfortable, that Cumberland, for all its sophistication and knowledge preservation, was still struggling with the fundamental problem of human social organization: how to distribute resources fairly, how to balance individual needs against collective survival, how to govern justly when survival itself was uncertain. Over his 2 years in Cumberland, he saw this tension play out repeatedly. The leadership genuinely seemed to believe in principles of fairness and democratic decision-making, but they also made decisions that prioritized stability and control over individual freedom. Dissenters were occasionally exiled. Rules about resource distribution were enforced strictly. There was something almost paternalistic in the way leadership operated, a belief that they knew what was best and should therefore make decisions for the community. But alongside this, Kael also saw remarkable dedication to knowledge sharing and community welfare. Cumberland sent doctors to other settlements to help with outbreaks. They trained specialists from other communities in techniques and knowledge. They genuinely seemed to want other settlements to prosper, even if it meant losing resources or people to them. Near the end of his 2 years in Cumberland, Kael called him in for what became a crucial conversation. "I want you to do something," Kael said. "I want you to go back to Haven and propose something to them. I want to propose an inter-settlement council, representatives from each of the major settlements meeting together monthly to discuss issues that affect the entire network." "What kind of issues?" Kael asked. "Everything," Kael said. "Disease threats, but also trade policies, resource sharing, conflicts between settlements, long-term planning. I think we've reached a point where we need some kind of coordinated governance for the network, even though each settlement remains independent." "That's a significant proposal," Kael said carefully. "Some settlements will see that as a threat to their independence." "I know," Kael said, "and maybe they're right to be worried. We're in new territory here. But I believe that the alternative, isolated settlements struggling individually against problems that require collective solutions, is worse. I think we need to try this, and I think you should be the one to propose it to the other settlements. You're young, you're not from Cumberland. You understand both the advantages of network connection and the fears of autonomy. You have credibility that I don't." Kael left Cumberland at the beginning of his 3rd year in the settlement. His task was to carry Kael's proposal to Haven and the other settlements, to gauge reactions, to help craft it into something that communities felt comfortable agreeing to. It was a massive responsibility, and it terrified him, but he was also 20 years old now. He had spent 3 years in an environment where learning and growth were expected, where knowledge was prized, where his contributions were treated as meaningful. Going back to Haven was returning to a place that still saw him as young, still expected him to defer to elders, still treated him primarily as a messenger rather than a thinker or leader. Yet Haven had also changed while he was gone. The connection to the network had accelerated changes in the settlement. Some people had left Haven to join other communities or to work in the messenger stations. New people had arrived from other settlements, bringing skills and knowledge with them. The settlement was larger, more connected, less isolated. Elena had passed away in his absence. She died peacefully in her sleep in the winter before his return. Marcus had moved toward leadership, and there were now 5 new council members, younger than the previous council, with less attachment to the old ways of thinking about Haven as an isolated community. When Kael presented Michael's proposal about the Intersettlement Council, the response was more favorable than he'd expected. There was caution, certainly, but also interest. The council agreed to send representatives to a founding meeting of the council, to be held in Cumberland in the summer. The founding meeting of the regional council, as it came to be called, brought together representatives from 18 settlements. It was a massive undertaking, with 3 days of discussion about what the council's structure should be, what power it should possess, and how it should make decisions. There were fierce debates about whether settlements should have votes proportional to population or equal votes regardless of size. There were arguments about whether the council should have authority to enforce decisions on settlements that disagreed with them. There were proposals and counter-proposals, compromises and revisions. In the end, they settled on a model where each settlement had equal representation in the council. But decisions required consensus or a supermajority, and no decision could force a settlement to act against its interests without that settlement's explicit agreement. It was a structure designed to prevent centralized power while still allowing collective decision-making. Whether it would actually work was another question entirely. Over the following 3 years, Kael became increasingly involved in the regional council's work. He was formally appointed as an archivist for the council, a position that involved maintaining records of council decisions, facilitating communication between settlements, and helping to organize the information that settlements shared with each other. It was prestigious work, and it gave him real influence in network affairs. But it also put him in a position to observe something troubling. As the regional council developed institutional structures, as it took on more functions and responsibilities, there was a tendency towards centralization that the founders had explicitly tried to prevent. The council was beginning to function almost like a government, with Cumberland serving as its de facto capital. Decisions made by the council, though technically non-binding, were increasingly treated as binding by settlements that wanted to maintain good relations with the rest of the network. This was brought into sharp relief when the council attempted to address something it called resource inequality, the fact that some settlements had access to better land, better climate or better knowledge, and therefore had significantly better material conditions than others. The proposal, which came primarily from Kael and his advisors, was to establish a redistribution system where settlements with surplus resources would contribute to a central fund, which would then be distributed to settlements facing difficulties. It was presented as a mutual aid system, a way to ensure that no settlement would collapse due to sudden misfortune, but many settlements saw it as theft. Why should they share the fruits of their labor with communities that, they believed, had simply failed to manage their resources properly? Asha from Rivermark was particularly vocal in opposition. "We've built what we have through hard work and good management. Now the council wants us to subsidize communities that have made worse choices. That's not solidarity. That's forced redistribution." The debate became heated. Kael countered that settlements didn't exist in a vacuum, that luck and geography played massive roles in settlement conditions, that true mutual aid meant being willing to sacrifice some surplus for the welfare of the network as a whole. "You're asking for communism," Asha said bluntly. "You're asking us to give up the fruits of our labor in the name of abstract equality. That might work if everyone was equally invested in the success of the network. But we're not. We're primarily invested in the survival of our own communities. You can't build something sustainable by asking people to work against their own interests." The council voted on the proposal, and it was approved by a narrow supermajority. But the opposition was strong enough that several settlements refused to participate. The central fund existed, but it was smaller and weaker than Kael had envisioned, funded primarily by Cumberland and a few other settlements committed to the principle of redistribution. Watching this play out, Kael realized something important. The regional council was reproducing, at a larger scale, the same tensions that every human society struggled with: how to balance individual interest and collective welfare, how to enforce fairness without becoming tyrannical, how to maintain unity while respecting autonomy. These problems hadn't been solved before the Pulse. There was no reason to expect they'd be solved in the New World, but the fact that they were being debated seriously that different settlements were trying different approaches, that the conversations were happening at all, that seemed like progress of a kind. The world after the pulse had the potential to be, if not better than the world before, at least different. Different in ways that might, with luck and effort, be better in some dimensions even if worse in others. Around this time, roughly 10 years after first contact between Haven and Cumberland, something unexpected happened. A group of survivors from the far south, from what had been Florida, arrived in Cumberland with stories of a different kind of civilization. The group was led by a woman named Kael, who claimed to represent a settlement called South Haven that had over 2,000 people. It was, by far, the largest settlement anyone in the network had encountered. South Haven had apparently developed in relative isolation, benefiting from the mild climate and abundant resources of the southern coast. It had a complex social structure, some degree of technological advancement, and most significantly, it had a different philosophy than Cumberland and the regional council. "We don't believe in this networked model," Kael explained. When Kael asked her about South Haven's approach, "We believe that settlements should be as self-sufficient as possible. We focus on developing our own knowledge, our own technology, our own social structures. We trade with other communities, but we don't join networks or councils. We see that as a path toward losing our independence." "How do you handle disease threats?" Kael asked carefully. "How do you warn each other about outbreaks?" "We maintain quarantine procedures," Kael said, "and we have some traders who pass information. But we don't believe in the kind of unified communication system you've built. We think it creates interdependence that makes all settlements vulnerable to disruption." The arrival of Kael and her delegation opened up a new set of questions for the regional council. If there were other successful settlements that had chosen a different path, did that validate the network approach or undermine it? Was the network the only viable path forward, or was it simply one option among many? Kael found himself assigned to work with Kael to understand South Haven's approach and its implications. As he did, he became fascinated by the possibility that there might be multiple valid approaches to rebuilding civilization. South Haven's self-sufficiency model had advantages. It maintained individual settlement autonomy, absolutely. It didn't require the complex coordination that the network demanded. It was less vulnerable to network-wide disruptions, but it also had disadvantages. Settlements couldn't benefit from specialized knowledge that had been developed elsewhere. They were more vulnerable to localized catastrophes. They couldn't share resources to help each other through crises. "Both models work," Kael said to him during one of their conversations. "They work because they're adaptive to their circumstances. We work in the South because our climate is stable and resources are abundant enough that we don't need as much interdependence to survive. Your network works in the North because the climate is harsher and resources are less abundant, so collective action increases everyone's security. The mistake would be to think one approach is universally right and the other wrong." This perspective was revelatory for Kael. It suggested that the puzzle of post-pulse civilization wasn't about finding a single right answer, but about understanding the principles that made different systems viable under different conditions. The network approach was optimal for resource-scarce regions where coordination could increase survival odds. The autonomy approach was optimal for resource-rich regions where settlements could afford independence. But there was also a middle path, settlements that maintained both independence and participation, that benefited from network resources and knowledge when it helped them, but could exit the network if they chose to, if the costs began to outweigh the benefits. Over the years that followed, the regional council gradually evolved towards something more like a confederation than a coordinated government. Settlements maintained membership not because they were compelled to, but because the benefits of participation exceeded the costs. New settlements joining the network could do so with full autonomy, choosing which aspects of network cooperation to embrace and which to avoid. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still moments where settlements felt like others were taking advantage of them or making unfair demands. But it worked well enough that the network continued to grow. By the time Kael was 30 years old, the regional council had grown to encompass nearly 50 settlements, spread across much of the former southeastern United States. More significantly, contact had been established with networks in other regions. There was apparently a network forming in the Midwest, centered around Chicago. There were settlements in the Southwest that had organized into their own council. There were scattered communities in the Northeast that were attempting to coordinate. The pulse had fragmented civilization, but the rebuilding process was bringing it back together, differently, more slowly. But genuinely, Kael found himself increasingly involved in this larger regional coordination. He helped establish communication systems between the various councils, worked on standardizing information formats so that knowledge could move freely between networks, and contributed to the development of what was being called the archive, a distributed collection of records maintained by multiple settlements and councils that documented the post-pulse world and the process of rebuilding. Civilization. It was meaningful work, but it was also work that increasingly took him away from Haven and from direct involvement in any single community. He became a figure who moved between settlements, who existed in the network itself, rather than in any particular location. Some people found this enviable. Others seemed to pity him for having no true home. Kael himself was ambivalent. He had achieved something like expertise and influence. He was one of the people who understood how the network functioned, who could navigate between different settlements and councils, who understood both the ideals and the practical limitations of what people were trying to build. But this very success isolated him from the daily life that most people lived. He wasn't a farmer, wasn't a craftsperson, wasn't embedded in the routines of any settlement. His work was important to the network, but it was abstract in a way that farming or building or medicine wasn't. When he was 32 years old, Kael called him to Cumberland with an unexpected proposal. The older man was in his 90s now, still sharp mentally but clearly slowing physically. "I'm retiring," he said simply. "Not from life, but from leadership. I want someone to take over the direction of the archive and the coordination work between councils. I think it should be you." Kael was shocked. "I'm too young," he protested. "There are people with more experience. There are people with more experience in specific domains," Kael interrupted. "But there's no one who understands the entire network the way you do. You were there at the beginning. You've helped build every part of the coordination infrastructure. You're respected by leaders in multiple councils. And most importantly, I think you understand something that took me decades to learn. That the goal is not to create a perfect system, but to create a system that's good enough to allow communities to cooperate while still maintaining their independence." Kael accepted the position, though with great trepidation. His role shifted from coordinator to leader. He moved to Cumberland permanently, established himself in the archive, and began the work of thinking about the long-term sustainability of the network and its relationship with the other councils forming across the continent. The work was harder than he expected. There were political challenges, settlements that felt underserved by the network, that believed they were contributing more than they received. There were resource allocation problems, people competing for access to rare materials or specialized knowledge. There were philosophical disagreements about what the goal of the network should be. Was it simply mutual survival? Was it trying to rebuild pre-pulse civilization? Was it trying to build something new and better? Different people had different answers, and the network existed in the space between those different visions. Around this time, about 80 years after the pulse, something significant began to change in the demographics of the settlements. The first generation born after the pulse, the ones who had no memory of the before times, were reaching adulthood and taking on leadership roles. These younger leaders had a different perspective than the elders who remembered electricity and cars, and all the material abundance of the before age. "I don't understand why we have to preserve all this knowledge about before," said a young man from one of the southern settlements. "The before times created the conditions for the pulse. They created the technology that fragmented our civilization. Why should we spend resources preserving that knowledge instead of focusing on creating something better?" This sentiment was increasingly common among the young leaders. They didn't have nostalgia for the before times. To them, the pulse wasn't a catastrophe, but simply history. They were building the world they had, and they saw no particular reason to fetishize the world that had been lost. Kael, now nearly 100 years old, became deeply troubled by this. In his final years, He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 103. He spoke frequently with Kael about this generational shift. "You have to preserve the knowledge," he insisted. "Not to recreate the before times, but because knowledge is power. Whoever controls information controls the future. If we lose the ability to understand how electricity works, we lose the ability to choose whether to rebuild it. We'll be trapped in whatever path we're on." Kael understood the logic, but he also understood the younger generation's perspective. There was something seductive about the idea of starting fresh, of not being constrained by the knowledge and nostalgia of the before times. Why should they rebuild the world that had created the pulse? Why not imagine something different? The tension played out in debates about resource allocation. The archive which Kael directed consumed significant resources: paper, ink, people's time and attention. The younger generation of leaders often questioned whether these resources wouldn't be better spent on current needs than on preserving knowledge about systems that no longer existed and might never exist again. Kael found himself in the position of defending the value of knowledge preservation, something he'd never particularly expected to do. He wasn't naturally nostalgic for the before times. He'd never lived in them. But he understood, as Kael had, that knowing how things worked gave you choices. If future generations wanted to rebuild electrical systems, they could. If they wanted to create something completely different, they could. But if the knowledge was lost, they'd have no choice at all. They'd be locked into the path their ancestors had established, through ignorance rather than through conscious decision. This struggle over what to preserve and what to let go became one of the defining tensions of the network in the decades following Kael's death. Different councils took different approaches. Some focused aggressively on preserving technical knowledge. Others, particularly those influenced by younger leaders, focused on building new cultural and social systems without as much attachment to the before times. The result was a kind of fragmentation within the network, not a hostile one, but a differentiation. Some settlements were attempting to slowly rebuild electrical systems. Others were consciously developing low-technology civilizations that they believed were more sustainable than the industrial model. Others were trying to find middle paths, using technology where it made sense, but not becoming dependent on it. Kael watched this happening and realized something important. The pulse had created a unique moment in human history. For a brief period, perhaps 100 years or so, before the knowledge was fully lost, humanity had the option of choosing its own future rather than having it determined by path dependence and institutional inertia. The settlements and councils that were trying different approaches weren't just building communities. They were conducting an experiment in alternative civilizations. Some of these experiments would succeed and spread. Others would fail. But the process itself was valuable, a kind of living laboratory for how societies could be organized. By the time Kael was 50 years old, the original network of 18 settlements had grown to encompass hundreds of communities across the region. Formal councils had been established across much of the continent. Trade routes had been established and maintained. Communication systems, based on relay stations and trained messengers, connected distant settlements. A kind of global conversation was happening, conducted slowly through letters that took weeks to travel, and information that was years out of date by the time it arrived. It wasn't the internet. It wasn't instant communication. But it was connection. And connection enabled coordinated action on problems that affected multiple settlements. The most significant test of the network came during what became known as the Second Plague, a disease that emerged in the western settlements and spread toward the coast despite quarantine efforts. For the first time, the communication networks that Kael had helped establish played a crucial role in containing an epidemic. Settlements received warning of the plague's approach weeks in advance. They prepared quarantine procedures. They shared information about what treatments seemed to work and what didn't. By the time the plague reached the eastern settlements, mortality rates were significantly lower than they had been in earlier epidemics, not because they had better medicine, but because they had better information and coordination. Hundreds of lives were saved by the network's coordinated response. It was a vindication of Kael's original vision, the idea that settlements could be independent while still benefiting from collective knowledge and mutual aid. After the Second Plague, the status of the archive and the coordination work became more secure. Even younger leaders who were skeptical of preserving pre-pulse knowledge acknowledged the value of preserving knowledge about what worked in dealing with post-pulse problems. An expanded archive was built in Cumberland, with branches in several other settlements. Kael trained a new generation of archivists and coordinators to help maintain and expand the system. His own role gradually shifted toward elder status. He was still involved in key decisions, but he was increasingly consulting rather than directing. Younger people took on more of the day-to-day work. There was something peaceful about this transition, though also something melancholy. He had devoted most of his adult life to building the network, and now it was becoming so well established that it didn't need him anymore. He found himself returning to Haven more frequently, visiting a settlement that he'd left more than 30 years earlier. Haven had changed significantly. It was larger, now approaching 200 people. It had invested in the network and benefited from knowledge sharing. But it had also maintained much of its original character. It was still a community focused primarily on subsistence and security, not on preserving technical knowledge or experimenting with new social structures. Elena and Marcus were both long dead. The current leadership of Haven was younger, had been born after the Pulse, and saw it as natural that Haven was part of a larger network. For them, it was the default state of how settlements related to each other. There were young people in Haven now who were curious about the wider network, interested in traveling to other settlements, eager to learn about the different approaches to civilization that were being attempted. Some left Haven to participate in other experiments. Some returned. Some stayed away. It was a natural process of people moving through communities, finding their places in the world. One afternoon, standing on the edge of Haven's agricultural fields and watching people work, Kael found himself thinking about the boy he'd been when he first left Haven 60 years earlier. He'd been restless, searching for something beyond the safe stability of the settlement. And he'd found it: adventure, knowledge, influence, the satisfaction of building something meaningful. But he also realized that the people who had stayed in Haven, who had built stable lives in a single community, who had focused on raising children and maintaining the local food systems and building relationships with the people around them, they had built something equally meaningful. Maybe more meaningful in some ways. They'd created stability and community in a world that was fundamentally uncertain. The restored world that humanity was building in the aftermath of the Pulse was not a return to the before times. It couldn't be. The knowledge was there, but it was recovering slowly, and more importantly, societies had made different choices about what to preserve and what to let go. In some places that meant rebuilding electrical systems. In other places it meant consciously rejecting technological dependency. In most places, it meant something in between, using technology where it was useful, but not allowing it to dominate life the way it had in the before times. The cities were slowly being repopulated, but not the way they had been before. The megacities of the before times, with millions of people, complex infrastructure, massive inequality, those weren't coming back. Instead, smaller cities were developing around regional hubs like Cumberland, places of 50 to 100,000 people that coordinated with networks of smaller settlements. It was a decentralization, but it was happening organically rather than through any imposed plan. By the time Kael was 60, the population of the network had stabilized at roughly 100,000 people across several hundred settlements. It was a fraction of the global population, concentrated in regions that had particular advantages for survival without massive technology. But it was stable and it was conscious. People knew they were rebuilding civilization, and they were making deliberate choices about what kind of civilization to build. The children born now, the third generation since the Pulse, the ones who would have no direct connection to anyone who remembered the before times, they were growing up in a world that was genuinely new. They attended schools that taught both pre-pulse knowledge and post-pulse innovation. They learned mathematics and chemistry, alongside traditional crafts and agricultural techniques. They had options that previous generations didn't have: to pursue specialized knowledge, to become scholars or engineers or healers, or to focus on subsistence skills. or to move between communities seeking different experiences. It was a world with material poverty compared to the before times. There was less stuff, less comfort, less security from material want. But in other ways there was abundance, community, purpose, connection to the natural world, the knowledge that your work directly served the people around you. Kael began to write, in his 60s, documenting the history of the network's formation. He worked with other elders who remembered the earlier years, trying to create a comprehensive record of how civilization had been rebuilt from the fragments of the before times. It was slow work, constrained by the limits of handwriting and hand copying, but it was important. This history would be what future generations understood about how their world had come to be. Getting it right mattered. One afternoon, while working on the documents, a young scholar from Cumberland named Iris came to him with a question. Why do we preserve all this knowledge about electricity and computing and industrial systems? She asked. We're not going to rebuild those things. We've chosen a different path. Kael set down his pen and considered the question carefully. It was the same question that young leaders had been asking for decades, but it never got old. It never got easy to answer. We preserve it, he said finally, because knowledge is freedom. Right now you've made a choice not to rebuild industrial civilization. That's a good choice, I think, but it's your choice to make. If we lose the knowledge, then your great-grandchildren won't have the option of making a different choice. They'll be trapped in whatever path you've set. Preserving knowledge means preserving the possibility of choosing differently in the future. But doesn't preserving that knowledge tempt people to go back to the before times? Iris asked. Doesn't it create pressure to rebuild what was lost? Maybe, Kael said, but I think people are smart enough to understand that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. The before times created too much inequality, too much dependence on fragile systems, too much separation from the natural world. Most people won't want to go back to that once they really understand what it means. But some might want to recover aspects of it, medical knowledge, for example, or specific technical skills. And I think it's important that they have the option. Iris left thoughtful but not fully convinced. Kael knew that this conversation would be repeated hundreds of times in the coming years and decades, each generation having to make its own decision about what knowledge to preserve and what to let go. There was no final answer, no moment when the decision could be made and then forgotten. It would have to be made repeatedly, actively by each generation. This was, he realized, one of the great differences between the before times and the new world. The before times had had a kind of momentum. Technological systems, economic systems, social systems all reinforced each other, creating a path that was very difficult to deviate from. Most people didn't choose the society they lived in. They inherited it, adapted to it, perpetuated it. Change happened, but slowly and usually through crisis. The post-pulse world was different, because so much had been destroyed, because knowledge had been fragmented, because settlements had to be intentional about what they preserved and how they organized themselves. There was space for genuine choice about the kind of society to build. Of course, choice was constrained by necessity and material reality. You couldn't have complex electrical systems without the manufacturing infrastructure to create and maintain them. You couldn't have large cities without reliable food supply. Material conditions imposed limits. But within those limits, there was genuine possibility for building societies that reflected different values and priorities than the societies that had come before. That was remarkable. That was worth preserving knowledge to protect. When Kael was 65 years old, the Regional Council organized a major gathering to mark 100 years since the Pulse. Settlements from across the network sent representatives to Cumberland for what was being called the Centenary Congress. The gathering took months. People couldn't travel quickly anymore, and coordinating such a large assembly required enormous logistical effort. But it happened. The Congress documented the current state of the network, 400 settlements across the northeastern and southeastern United States, plus growing contact with networks in other regions. Population had stabilized at roughly 150,000 in the network region. Life expectancy had increased to approximately 50 years on average, which was still less than the before times, but represented significant progress from the 20 to 30-year averages of the early post-Pulse years. Birth rates had stabilized at sustainable levels. Agriculture was productive. Craft and manufacturing had recovered to the point where settlements could produce most of what they needed locally, with trade filling gaps. But the Congress also raised difficult questions about the future. The eldest survivors of the before times were nearly all dead now. Soon there would be no one alive who could remember electricity and automobiles and all the luxuries and horrors of industrial civilization. The memory of the before times would become history, then legend, then myth. How would that change the project of rebuilding? Would communities continue to preserve knowledge about systems that nobody could remember? Would they preserve it accurately, or would it get distorted as it passed through more and more hands? And there were other questions. What about the regions where the network had no presence? There were reports of settlements to the west that had not made contact. Were they thriving or struggling? Were there communities that had chosen fundamentally different paths, that had rejected the idea of network coordination entirely? What did survival look like outside the regional councils? The Congress passed resolutions to attempt broader contact, to try to reach settlements further west and south. It also established what was called the Global Archive, a distributed collection of records that would be maintained in multiple settlements and councils, so that knowledge wouldn't be lost even if individual copies were destroyed or settlements failed. It was ambitious work, and it was work that would take generations to complete. But that was acceptable. The post-Pulse world had learned to think in terms of generations. Individual lifespans were still short by pre-Pulse standards, but communities could now plan for futures that extended beyond any single person's life. Kael participated in the Centenary Congress, but found himself thinking increasingly about mortality. He was 65 years old. By post-Pulse standards, he was entering old age. He didn't know how many more years he had. The thought that had once terrified him, that the world might continue without him, that his contributions might be forgotten, now felt almost peaceful. The network was established. The archive was secure. Younger people were trained and ready to continue the work. His personal continuation was no longer essential. After the Congress, he spent more time in Haven, helping the settlement's teachers develop curriculum for the younger children. It was quiet work, less dramatic than the network coordination that had occupied most of his adult life. But it was satisfying in a different way. These children would grow up in a world very different from the one he'd grown up in, a world where connection to the wider network was simply assumed. They would have opportunities and options that he'd never had. And maybe they would take the work he'd helped establish and take it somewhere he couldn't imagine. One evening, sitting with a small group of teenagers in Haven, one of them asked him about the early days, what it had been like when he'd first left the settlement to scout the northern route. Kael found himself telling them the story. The encounter with the patrol, the discovery of Cumberland, the realization that his settlement wasn't alone. "Were you scared?" one of the girls asked. "Yes," Kael admitted. "Very scared. I was 17 years old and barely understood what fear was. But yes, I was terrified. But you left anyway," the boy said. "It wasn't a question. I left anyway," Kael confirmed. The teenagers absorbed this in silence. He knew what they were thinking. That courage was taking action despite fear. That you could do important things even when you were frightened and uncertain about the outcome. "Did you regret it?" another girl asked. "Leaving Haven?" Kael considered this carefully. It was a question he'd asked himself many times over the decades. "No," he said finally. "I didn't regret it, but I also wouldn't say it was the right choice for everyone. Some people stayed in Haven and built good lives here. Some people left and found what they were looking for elsewhere. Neither choice was wrong. They were just different responses to the world we found ourselves in." He paused, then added, "But I will say this, I'm glad the choice existed. I'm glad we'd rebuilt enough civilization by the time I was growing up, that it was actually possible to leave, to travel, to find other communities. In the earliest years after the Pulse, people didn't have that option. They survived where they landed, and that was all they could do. But within a generation or two, choice became possible again. That matters. The teenagers left with their questions answered, but also with new questions forming. Questions about what they wanted from their lives, where they might want to go, what role they might want to play in the continuing work of building civilization. That seemed right. That was how change happened, how knowledge passed between generations, through conversation and story, and the transmission of values and possibilities. Kael's health began to decline when he was 70 years old. It started with persistent pain in his joints, then with breathing difficulties. A healer from Cumberland came to Haven and examined him, then gave him the honest assessment. His heart was not functioning well, and there was no treatment available in the post-pulse world that could fix it. He had perhaps a year, maybe 2 if he was lucky. The diagnosis didn't shock him. He'd lived longer than most people he'd grown up with. He'd had a full life, meaningful work, access to knowledge and experience that most people didn't get. He was ready, more or less, to die, but he also wanted to finish the work. He wanted to complete the history of the network, to document his own role and perspective so that future generations could understand how it had all happened. He spent his remaining months writing, working with Iris and others who came to Haven to help him get the stories down on paper. He told them about Kael, about the founding of the regional council, about the principles that had guided the network's development. He talked about the tensions between different settlements, about the ongoing struggle to balance individual autonomy with collective action. He described what the before times had been like as told by elders, what had been lost, what had been deliberately preserved, what had been allowed to fade away. The most important thing, he told Iris in one of their final conversations, is to understand that this wasn't inevitable. The way we've organized ourselves, the choices we've made about what to preserve and what to change, those weren't predetermined. They were the result of deliberate decisions made by people who were trying to figure out how to survive and build something meaningful. Future generations might make different choices. That's okay. That's how civilizations should work. But they should understand that they're making choices, that there are alternatives, that nothing is inevitable. Kael died in Haven in the spring, at the age of 72. It was a peaceful death. He went to sleep and didn't wake up. The settlement held a gathering to mark his passing, and people from other communities came to pay their respects. Kael was long gone, but his legacy lived on in the people he'd trained and influenced. Eleanor and Marcus had died decades earlier, but Haven had endured and grown beyond what they'd established. In the years after his death, Kael became a historical figure in the stories that settlements told about the founding of the regional council. The boy who'd left Haven at 17 and discovered Cumberland. The young man who'd helped establish communication between settlements. The archivist who'd worked to preserve knowledge about both the before times and the post-pulse world. The elder who'd documented the network's founding and principles. Some stories got distorted as they passed through generations. He became, in some versions, more heroic than he'd actually been, more central to events than he truly was. In other versions, his role was minimized, absorbed into larger narratives about settlement leaders and collective effort. But that was okay. That was how history worked. The important thing was that people understood that individuals had agency in shaping the world. That conscious choices about how to rebuild mattered. That knowledge was worth preserving. 150 years after the Pulse, a young scholar from a Western settlement came to the archive in Cumberland, researching the history of the regional network. She found records of Kael's work, documents he'd written, notes from people who'd known him. She read about the early scouting mission, the encounter with Risa, the founding of the council, the decades of coordination work. As she researched, she became curious about something specific. What had happened to Kael's descendants? Did he have children? Did his legacy continue through a family line? The records suggested he never had children. He'd devoted his life to building the network and preserving knowledge, but not to building a family. It was a choice that had seemed reasonable in his own time. The network was, in a sense, his life's work, his contribution to the future. But the scholar found herself wondering whether that was a loss, whether something important had been missing from his life because he hadn't experienced the intimate ties of family and children. Then she found something, a record of a girl born in Haven, approximately 20 years after Kael's death, who showed particular aptitude for scholarship and who went on to study in Cumberland. The girl's mother had been one of the teenagers who'd spent time learning from Kael in his final years. She'd been influenced by his stories and his commitment to knowledge preservation, and she'd passed that influence to her daughter. The scholarship showed that Kael had descendants of sorts, not biological children, but intellectual heirs, people whose thinking had been shaped by his ideas and example. The knowledge he'd worked to preserve had passed into the minds of people who came after him, who used it to inform their own work. That was a kind of legacy, a kind of immortality through influence rather than through genetics. 200 years after the Pulse, settlements had expanded and created their own councils in every region of North America. Some had adopted approaches similar to Cumberland's, with strong emphasis on knowledge preservation and technical education. Others had consciously rejected that path, choosing instead to focus on sustainable subsistence practices and reduced technological complexity. Most existed somewhere between those poles, using technology where it made sense, but not allowing it to dominate their societies. The population had recovered to roughly 100 million globally, concentrated in regions with favorable climate, good soil, access to water. Large portions of the planet had lower population density than before the Pulse, as cities had largely depopulated and rural areas had become the dominant settlement pattern. This had environmental effects. Forests were recovering, wildlife populations were rebounding. The accelerated climate change of the industrial era had slowed to more gradual shifts. The process had been difficult and chaotic, full of failure and suffering alongside success and growth. But it had also been, in many ways, generative. Communities had learned to make conscious choices about their organization and values. People had rediscovered skills that had been nearly lost. The fragmentation had forced innovation and local adaptation rather than allowing one-size-fits-all solutions imposed from above. By the third and fourth generations after the Pulse, the before times were becoming genuinely distant history. There were no survivors left who remembered electricity or automobiles. The technology was known about but not viscerally understood. The way that medieval people knew about Roman civilization, a distant past that had been lost and might potentially be recovered, but not the lived reality of the present. This created a new kind of problem: how to motivate the preservation of knowledge about systems that young people had never experienced and might never use. Why spend scarce resources maintaining detailed information about things like industrial electricity generation or computer networks when those resources could be used for immediate needs? The answer that most councils came to was pragmatic. Preserve enough knowledge that future generations could choose to rebuild if they wanted to, but don't treat preservation as the primary purpose of society. Focus on creating sustainable communities in the present, but maintain enough institutional memory that technical knowledge wasn't completely lost. Libraries and archives became the primary repositories of pre-Pulse knowledge. Most settlements maintained small libraries with books salvaged from before the Pulse or copied by hand. Regional libraries in major settlements held larger collections, and the Global Archive, which existed in multiple locations, held comprehensive records of human knowledge from the before times, carefully preserved against loss or degradation. It was a compromise solution, neither fully preserving nor fully abandoning pre-Pulse knowledge. It reflected the profound ambivalence that post-Pulse civilization felt about the world that had come before. The world before had been remarkable in many ways, capable of extraordinary achievements: medical advances, artistic creation, scientific understanding, material comfort. But it had also been profoundly fragile, built on systems that couldn't sustain themselves, creating inequality and suffering on massive scales, ultimately collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. The new world was not better in every way than the world before. People had shorter lifespans, less access to medicine, fewer consumer goods, more vulnerability to disease and accident. But in other ways it was better. Less inequality, more connection to community and land, more agency in determining the shape of one's own life, less dependence on fragile technological systems. Different communities made different judgments about which aspects of this trade-off were acceptable and which should be resisted. Some pushed toward restoring technological complexity, believing that quality of life required it. Others pushed toward simplification, believing that the technology had been a mistake that shouldn't be repeated. Most wobbled between the positions, trying to harvest the benefits of technology while avoiding its worst consequences. 300 years after the Pulse, the world had achieved a kind of equilibrium. Population was stable at approximately 500 million globally, with the remainder of the planet wild or only lightly inhabited. Technology had recovered to approximately 19th century levels in most advanced settlements. Mechanical power sources, chemical manufacturing, medical knowledge based on herbal remedies and surgical techniques refined over centuries of practice. Some settlements had achieved electrical generation through water mills and wind power, though electricity generation remained expensive and was used primarily for specialized purposes like lighting and communication, rather than for powering entire populations. The fragmentation of civilization that had seemed catastrophic at the time of the Pulse had proven, over the long term, to be surprisingly generative. Having multiple centers of power and knowledge, multiple experiments with different social organizations, multiple visions of what civilization could be, this had created a kind of civilizational biodiversity. Some experiments had failed and been abandoned. Others had succeeded and spread. The result was not a monoculture imposed from a single center, but a complex ecology of different approaches with some universal principles: the preservation of knowledge, the importance of trade and communication, the value of cooperation on shared challenges, but with enormous local variation in implementation. The descendants of Haven, 4 or 5 generations removed from Kael's time, lived in a settlement that had grown to approximately 5,000 people. It maintained connections to the regional network, traded with other settlements, sent some of its young people to study in the archive and other centers of learning. But it also maintained its own identity and local autonomy. Haven was neither a backwater nor a center of civilization, but a solid, functioning community where people lived meaningful lives in connection with each other and with the land. The descendants of Cumberland had built a city of approximately 30,000 people, a true urban center by post-Pulse standards. It maintained the archive, operated schools and training centers, coordinated trade across the region. But it also faced the same challenges that all centers of power faced: how to maintain legitimacy, how to prevent the accumulation of power and resources from creating unjust inequality, how to balance growth with sustainability. None of these problems had been solved definitively. They couldn't be, because they were inherent to any human society, but they were being addressed thoughtfully, with the wisdom of centuries of trial and error informing the approaches taken. And the memories of Kael and Kael and the other founders were preserved in the stories that communities told, in the principles that guided the councils, in the commitment to both preserve knowledge and allow change. The work of rebuilding civilization was continuing, carried forward by people who understood themselves as part of a long project that extended back to the Pulse and forward to indefinite future generations. A child born in Haven 500 years after the Pulse, sitting by a fire while an elder told stories, heard the tale of the boy who'd walked the empty roads and discovered that his settlement wasn't alone. The story had changed and been simplified over the centuries, had been compressed into the archetypal form that all origin stories take. But the essential elements remained: that isolation was not inevitable, that knowledge could be preserved, that conscious choices about how to organize society mattered, that the future was not determined but was something that communities could shape through deliberate action. The child listening to this story didn't know that it was based on actual events that had happened centuries earlier. For them, it was simply a myth about how their civilization had begun, a myth that conveyed truths about human agency, about the possibility of growth and connection, about the fragility and resilience of communities, and that was appropriate. Myths were how civilizations passed knowledge and values between generations. The specific facts of Kael's individual life didn't matter as much as what his life represented. The idea that individual choices mattered, that exploring beyond one's immediate community could lead to discoveries, that deliberately choosing how to rebuild civilization was possible and important. The empty streets that Kael had walked in his youth were no longer empty, though not in the way the before times would have understood. They were no longer highways for automobiles, but they were paths that people used for trade and travel, maintained by regional councils, marked with way stations where travelers could find shelter and water. They were connections between communities, rather than rivers of individual vehicles carrying people in isolation. The ruins of the before times were still visible, would probably always be visible. Crumbling buildings, corroded vehicles, fragments of structures that had been built to last for decades, but not for centuries. But they were being slowly reclaimed by the land and by human communities, who repurposed the materials into new structures serving new purposes. The before times weren't being actively destroyed or forgotten, they were being incorporated into the landscape, becoming part of the geological and cultural record rather than the dominant reality. And that seemed right. The pulse had been a catastrophe, but it had also been a kind of reset, an opportunity to rebuild consciously rather than simply inheriting systems and structures from the past. Future civilizations would face their own catastrophes, their own moments of choice about how to organize society. They would make mistakes that Kael's generation had tried to prevent, and they would achieve things that Kael couldn't have imagined. That was as it should be. Each generation had to make its own decisions about what civilization should be. The networks that Kael had helped build had endured and evolved. They had prevented the complete fragmentation of knowledge that could have happened if each settlement had become entirely isolated. They had enabled collective problem-solving on challenges that no individual community could have addressed alone. They had created space for both diversity of approach and shared commitment to common principles. But they had also imperfectly addressed questions of equality, justice, and power. Communities within the network still struggled with resource distribution, with the balance between individual autonomy and collective good, with how to make decisions that affected everyone without tyrannizing minorities. These problems hadn't been solved. They probably couldn't be solved completely, but they were being addressed consciously by communities that understood themselves as engaged in an ongoing experiment with civilization. In a deep archive, carefully maintained and frequently copied to preserve against loss, there were records that told the story of those early days. Records of first contact between settlements, of the founding councils, of the principles that had guided the rebuilding. And scattered through those records were references to a young man who had walked between communities carrying messages and knowledge, who had helped establish the systems that kept the network connected. Future historians would study these records and try to understand Kael's role, his significance, his legacy. Some would credit him with far more than he'd actually done. Others would minimize his contribution, seeing him as simply one of many people who'd worked to rebuild civilization. But most would understand something essential about what he represented: the possibility that individual action could matter. The communities weren't doomed to isolation or to imitate the mistakes of the past. That conscious choice about how to build society was not just possible but necessary. And in the night, in settlements throughout the recovering world, children would hear stories about the boy who discovered that his world was larger than he'd known, who chose to go out and explore, who helped connect communities and preserve knowledge for future generations. Whether those children took from the story a lesson about courage, or about community, or about the importance of curiosity, they would carry some echo of Kael's life forward into their own futures. The world had ended, and the world had begun again. Not as a return to what had been, but as a new creation, shaped by memory of what had come before, constrained by the material realities of existence on Earth, but ultimately a genuine novelty. A civilization being built by people who understood themselves as engaged in an act of creation, not bound by the path dependence and institutional inertia that had constrained the before times. That was Kael's legacy, and the legacy of all those who had lived in the first centuries after the pulse, the world that was possible after catastrophe. Not perfect, not without problems or suffering or injustice, but genuine, conscious, built by human hands and human choices, in full awareness of what had been lost and what might yet be created.